Hello, we're gonna start out with this dynamic example. I'm facing Alexander Shabalov in US Chess Championship playing with white pieces. I encounter an opening surprise and I'm gonna break it down for you guys how I come up with my solutions. So similarly to think like a grandmaster, I will be breaking it down piece by piece what it takes to play the best move in a position. A lot of it is going to be positional, and at the same time, a lot of the decisions are going to be tactical as well. So hopefully we're going to have a really nice balance going on. So let's start with the opening. My opponent chooses e6, tempting me to get into some French situations, which I have little idea about. But I play c4, which is pretty standard for d4 players. Now knight f6, knight f3, and c5. Here I used to play g3 in this position. I'm sure my opponent was well prepared. Every time I play him the opening moves, he plays fairly quickly. Really well prepared chess player, plays every single opening in the world. And here we're going to be playing Benoni. g6. Here in this position of white plays d6, white can continue e4. And the trick is, if knight takes e4, then black has a real nice tactics, and it's not queen e2, because after queen e2, queen e7, but queen a4, and the knight is gone right there. So this is a little trick right here, and d6 is fairly logical, but this is not something black generally wants to allow, because I think there's a more flexible structure, and the knight can jump to d2 quite a bit, defending the knight on f3 and having the possibility to jump to c4, being supported by a4. So here g6 is the way to go, knight c3, now d6, and bishop goes to f4. So this move puts pressure on d6. For you guys who are just starting out, I would just suggest instead of trying to get to understand everything, just pay attention to how the pieces come out. So you can see at this point I'm developing, I have 3 pieces developed, and there's the pawn right there in the center, which is fairly obvious. So I create this open space right here. Obviously white is ahead in space, ahead in development, 3 pieces versus just 1 piece right here. So black develops the bishop, and here I play a slightly mysterious check right here, queen a4. The idea is that however, well, for one thing, black doesn't want to move the king, that's for sure. Now if black can block with 3 of these pieces, but each one of those moves is gonna have a disadvantage, especially the fact that d6 is hanging, making it difficult for black to coordinate in this situation. My opponent plays bishop d7, hitting the queen, and now 2 spots are hanging, the b7 and d6 right here. So here logically queen c7 is the way to go. So you would ask, well, why was the check useful? Now it's not knight b5. The knight b5 would actually help black. Then bishop takes, and now black's knight comes to a natural position where this bishop is blocking the knight from coming to d7. So that's the whole point. Now instead of playing queen c7, all of a sudden my opponent plays b5. Now that shouldn't be a surprise for me, because there's been many games played for black in this position. However, that was a surprise for me, and that's the first time that I ever saw that move, b5. So certainly a typical tactical idea. Black is looking to gain initiative, and I have an option of capturing either b5 or d6. So here's the question, or maybe not capturing at all and continuing my development. So let's consider the last option. So let's say I play e3 right here. Now the challenge is that black is going to build up this this attack, and the very unpleasant move is, well, actually b4 is not so easy to deal with either, because now the knight, where should it go? If it goes to a4, well, here I'm losing this knight straight away. If knight goes to b1, let's say, which looks like a terrible square, but it's actually not that bad, because knight is going to want to go to d2 towards c4. Now this position doesn't seem to be that bad for white. The challenge is, well, for example, if knight e4, this works out perfect for white. Knight d2, and then one of the knights is going to reach c4. On the other hand, black could try to do something like a5 with the idea of pushing a4 and a3. d5 is still vulnerable, and this could be a little bit tricky right here. So, and also after e3, c4 is not so pleasant, because now b4 is still a threat. d5 is going to be hanging here. If queen goes to b4, potentially there's a5, knight a6 type stuff, followed by b4. Black could just castle and have all those threats coming right there. So this is a big challenge right there. So I can certainly pick up the d6 pawn, but then I might get punished for it. So very soon you realize that you actually got to accept one of those pawns sacrificed by black. And here I go, capturing the pawn on d6. So that was an opening surprise for me, but my opponent played it immediately. I didn't take that long to figure it out, but it still took me 15 to 20 minutes to play out all the moves. Now that's not too bad. One thing you don't want to do is tank and just sit there and waste your time just thinking about the possibilities. A lot of times you see an opening surprise that is kind of may seem a little bit dangerous. Here, for example, b4 is the threat, c4 is some ideas, knight jumps to e4, d6 may be vulnerable, queen goes to b6, all sorts of ideas that easy to overlook opportunities by black. On the other hand, you don't want to lose the game momentum, because if black gains momentum as you're taking too long to figure things out, you're at the disadvantage. So how do you play quick enough facing an opening surprise? Well, a lot of times you want to lower your standards for the best move that you're looking for. Act from common sense. For example, here, why is bishop d6 the move? Well, there's two pawns available for me to capture. There's the b5 hanging, and there's d6 hanging. Which pawn is better? Fairly obvious. d6 is the better pawn, especially if bishop takes. Now my bishop is going to be blocking the king from castling. Imagine queen goes to e3. Well, I just win the game right there. Now, that's probably not going to happen, but I just did pick up the central pawn. b5 is the inferior pawn to d6. So I'm picking up that central pawn right there, as it looks now for nothing. And I'm gaining some initiative in the game. Now, queen b6 is the obvious response. And here, what should white play? Well, once again, this is an easy move to play right here. I play bishop e5. First time I see this position once again. But bishop e5, why does that make sense? Well, obviously, black's biggest asset is that bishop along this, shooting along that diagonal. So I want to neutralize it. So I put my bishop to face the fianchetto bishop right there. Once the knight moves, I exchange one piece. Why do I want to exchange pieces? Well, I'm ahead in material. I'm positionally better, having a better centralized situation. Actually, my black's development is better and more dynamic. At the same time, I do have options to get my pieces out to good positions, and my knights, the pieces that I got right now, are actually in fairly good spots. I do have some options in the game. Black castles, I play e3. Now, why e3? Well, this is simple as well. Why choose e3 over other options? there are not that many options here for white. e4 is overly ambitious, so this is the moves that you don't want to experiment with when you face an opening surprise. Here there's quite a few challenges with e4. For one thing, this knight is defending the pawn on e4, but it can be easily harassed right there by b4, and then e4 goes down. Rook e8 could cause some trouble in the position. There's no reason to play e4. e3 should be played. And when you face an opening surprise, when your opponent sacrifices something, and a lot of times your opponent's going to get the development edge, so you want to pay attention. Your number one priority should be getting your pieces out as quickly as possible, so you can defend well, counterattack. My opponent goes for a logical b4, and here that's a bit of a choice for me. I took a few minutes out here, so I have a couple options. Knight a4 is not really one of them, because after queen a5 I'm in trouble. So it's either knight b1 or knight d1. Also, I do have bishop f6. This is actually interesting. Bishop f6, and if bishop captures, I can play knight e4. I can develop my bishop really nicely, and here I see very little compensation for black. White is very, very comfortable right here. So bishop takes f6. Black would take with a queen, and if I continue with the knight, now the b2 is hanging. So this is certainly the type of position that black wants. Now I'm forced to play knight d1, and once again, this is not a bad position at all. But black certainly has a nice initiative going, and I expect black to come up with a few interesting ideas where black is going to at least equalize. Now after b4, there's no reason to give up that bishop. This is a beautiful piece, and unless black gets that bishop out and wants to play knight bd7, my bishop on e5 is safe. Now it's very likely that the bishop is going to move and knight is going to come to d7, so I should be on top of the game and cautious. Now the real choice is whether I should play knight d1 versus knight b1 right there. So why play knight d1? Well, knight d1 allows me to develop, place the rook to c1. There's a better connection. Obviously, if knight goes to b1, it blocks the rook right there. And in order to choose between those two moves, I gotta find the advantages for both moves. So the advantage of knight goes to b1 is that my knight develops to d2 and goes to the essential square to c4. So the challenge is to see whether I do have those two moves to get my knight to an excellent position on c4. And as I was calculating, I realized that one thing, if you put the knight on d1, where is it going? Okay, so it's out of squares. I do have better chances to develop properly. Knight on d1 is defending the pawn on b2 in case things get a little bit out of control. So there's certainly advantages to it, immediate advantages. However, in the long term, it's going to be much better to get that knight to b1 and come to d2. My opponent does develop the knight to d7. So here, what is white's first instinct? Once again, facing a novelty, facing a new position for me, I realized that I got to get my pieces out. Sure, it feels like I have a better position, since I have an extra pawn. No doubt I should consider being better in this position. Now the problem is that my pieces are not developed quite properly yet. My king is still in the center. Black's pieces are all out right here. Black does have certain positional weaknesses, so black's initiative may be enough to get some material back, but I certainly could take advantage of those positional weaknesses. Now, number one, once again, is the challenge, development challenge. So here's a beautiful move that I play, and it turns out to be a novelty. It seemed like a common sense and necessity for me to play in this position. I think this is an excellent opportunity for white to solve all the problems right there all at once. Bishop d3. Now what does that do? Well, I'm gonna get a pair of bishops off the board. To begin with, this bishop on e5, despite the fact that it looks like it's hanging, is defended by my knight, and the other knight can come to support the knight from e5. So it's well connected. It seems a little bit loose, and it is, but overall my position is fairly solid right here. So white square's advantage for me, that c4 square available, is a big deal. And here, after bishop d3, I'm gonna reduce the number of pieces on the board, and certainly what's working to my opponent's advantage is his ability to create some dynamic play. Now, as opposed to other examples that you're gonna see on this DVD, here I don't want any dynamic play. I want to complete the development safely. So that's a priority. That should be a priority for you 99% of the time, as opposed to winning some stuff, getting into some adventures. You want to first get your pieces in dynamic spots, block your opponent's play, block your opponent's attacking play. Rarely that you want to be attacked. Here I don't want my opponent to develop an attack. I want to stabilize things, and along the way my opponent manages to get some material back. So here e5 is hanging, d5 is hanging. So my opponent is getting that pawn back, but it's not a big deal because I'm bringing another piece right there into a central position, kicking my opponent's queen. And after bishop captures f5, here's a couple options for my opponent. He can take the bishop, he can recapture the bishop, or take on g2. This is a possibility. So here I had a little tactical situation to calculate. I was going to play castle, g takes f, and I'm sure there's quite a few interesting solutions. Well, actually I wasn't going to castle, I was going to play king e2. Point being that now f2 is defended, and I can bring one of my rooks to g1 and get the attack rolling along g file. Now that seems like the king is in a tricky spot, but it's actually really safe out here. For example, if queen h2, trying to make a check from h5, I actually just return my rook and bring the other rook. Now all the difference is that now there's no pawn on h2, so both of these rooks are killing the king side. My knights are connected, and as you can see, this knight could jump to d6, coming towards f5 or f7. So if queen retreats to defend those squares, I can now continue on to double the rooks, for example. This is a bit of a tricky spot, obviously some things to calculate, but this could pay off big for white. Let's say queen c2 could be another alternative, going after f5, hitting all the weaknesses right here. This could end up for black really bad. Now I do have other alternatives as well, which are going to give me a massive compensation and winning attacking edge on the king side. So black didn't go for g2 and just captured on f5. So here castle is fairly straightforward. Rook develops. I bring my rook to d1. Here in the game, initially my opponent gained some momentum on the clock, putting me in a small time disadvantage, but then after I played the bishop d3 back on move 15, offering to exchange those bishops, this came quite unexpected, and my opponent realized that I had some nice endgame prospects. One of the possibilities was to go ahead and exchange the bishop, queen takes, knight captures, takes, and then play queen d6. So that way the f5 wouldn't be a problem, the f5 double pawns right there. So here though, knight c4, queen d5, we could have got an endgame kind of like this, king e2, let's say knight b6, rook c1, let's say rook goes to d8, knight d3, rook c8, which my opponent assessed as about equal. That's what he told me after the game. But as you can see, my knights are blocking black's position pretty badly. And if, let's say, rook d1, and at one point this knights go off the board, well, you can see there's this big weakness on c5. Black can certainly manage that. So tactically, black may not be doing all that bad. Here, for example, I wouldn't be able to pick up this pawn because there's a little check right here. But I could stabilize and slowly build it up. For example, build up on the king side, start expanding right about here, build up a little pawn structure, possibly f4, e4, maybe exchange some pieces as well, exchange a pair of rooks. If I could manage that, I could do well. But this is a nice small edge that a lot of times grandmasters, including myself, like to use. The idea is that it's very unlikely that you're gonna lose, but very likely that you're gonna maintain that pressure throughout the game. So that's the kind of endgame that I was looking for in this game, facing this opening novelty and playing against a very aggressive player. So let's see how things evolve in the game. I capture, go ahead and castle, bring my rook to the game, and now playing knight d3. So this is an interesting idea. My knight is tied to the knight on e5, so they're actually really well connected, but at the same time I cannot move my c4 knight. So I maneuver my d3, my knight from e5 to d3, having the options to jump to f4 or c5. Here certainly I expected knight e4. After knight e4, I'm not sure if f3 is the option. Most likely it's not, because after knight d6, if knight captures, e3 is hanging. So my idea was to play knight f4, bring the knight towards d5, maybe retreat the queen first. Well, actually knight f4 and then followed by f3. That sounds like fun for white right here. And then knight comes to d5. So I'm dominating all of those central squares. My opponent plays a nice queen e7 move. I move my knight to f4, maneuvering, and now bishop h6. So here, within a few moves, actually knight e2 is a nice idea. Computer recommends to actually allow black to capture the knight, just continue normally, but probably with like g3. But at the same time, during the game, I didn't really consider the fact that allowing black to capture that knight is a good idea, since that doubles white's pawns. At the same time, black's king is vulnerable right there, and quite possibly after, let's say, rook e1, bishop takes, pawn takes, I could develop some initiative. Knight e5, knight e3, on the king right there, potentially target that c5 pawn with queen c2. I play knight e2. This is a nice predetermined maneuver right there, and I want to go to g3 and hit that f5 weakness. Queen e6, queen c2, maneuvering the queen to hit the f5, and rook d5 right here. That's a nice creative effort by my opponent. He consistently plays well here, and very difficult for me to get anything substantial. So I continue my knight's journey. And here rook e1. So here I think I tricked my opponent a little bit. What he should have done is exchange this pair of rooks first. That way it would have been easier for him to hold this position. Now after bishop f4, I remove my rook, and now here's the challenge. You want to know why you want to make certain exchanges, and you want to be exchanging for a reason. So there's got to be a criteria. So here in this position, this is a dynamic play. Black has a vulnerable king, and it makes sense to get, as I was exchanging earlier with that bishop d3, developing the piece and getting one of the pieces off the board. I was behind in development. Now black is behind in terms of king safety. So if your king is vulnerable, your opponent is going to be putting pressure on them with the pieces, and black king is going to be at a disadvantage. So getting rid of the pair of rooks right there makes a lot of sense. Now after rook e1, my opponent plays queen g4. So at the same time, that rook on d5 is not that bad. So it's a little bit double-edged. Now a very attractive move for me right here is knight e4. Why it feels and is a strong move on the surface is because, let's say, knight, for one thing, right now I'm threatening to win the game with picking up that knight on f6. So knight takes e4, queen takes e4, my queen is well defended right here. I'm hitting the rook on d5, and I'm threatening with g3 right here. So this would be quite a challenge for black. Now after knight e4, there's a beautiful tactical idea by black, and you guys can take a moment, pause the video, and figure out the solution here. Bishop takes h2. Boom. So that's a nice tactical idea, and that's something that I saw. Initially I wanted to play knight e4, but quickly saw that after bishop h2, king captures, queen h4, and knight g4. Very difficult for white to defend. There's nothing but knight f6 to save white from a checkmate, and after knight or queen captures, black just won a pawn. Obviously that's not something white wants to allow. So I continue, knight e3. Now that's a nice move right here. Bishop has to take, and I take with a pawn to open up my rook on f. And still this rook could be active as I double my rooks on f, or pushing that pawn forward. Queen retreats, and I play queen c4. That's an excellent move I played. So the threat is to take on f6 and pick up the rook on d5, putting some pressure right there. After rook e5, I transfer my queen to the king side. Knight e8, and here I had a few interesting ideas. I went for the one that made a lot of sense at the moment. Here possibly rook f3, rook f4, maybe sacrificing that pawn right there. Ideas like king h1 could be possible. Quite a few different ideas, but knight h5 made a lot of sense, because one of the defensive moves for black after knight e8 is to play knight g7. So I play knight h5, and if knight goes to g7, big mistake, knight goes to f6. So I'm pinning that knight right there. I'm not allowing the knight to move. At the same time, knight going away from g3, I create this square right here for the queen to hit the king, hit the rook. Rook wants to come to f3 and g3. So that seemed like an attractive option for me. Queen g6, knight f4, coming back. Well, actually, that's a little maneuver that I improved my position. Knight h5, and after queen g6, I'm bringing the knight to f4. Now it's hard to say where knight is better, on g3 on f4, because from g3 it would also go to f5. The h5 square that I went to, from f4 it does block my rook on f1, but at the same time it can go to d5, it can go to d3, hitting the rook and the pawn on c5. So this game is fairly in a dynamic stage as well, so it's not that easy to say which one is the best positional idea. So knight goes to g7. Here queen retreated for obvious reasons. I want to continue the attack. I'm actually setting up some semi-traps right here with possibility of knight e6 and the queen breaking in. Now my opponent plays knight g7. So this was a mistake in the game. Well, my opponent should have played knight d6, and instead of placing the knight where it actually defends, my opponent should have played knight d6, putting the knight right there in that central square. And here knight from d6 also defending the f7. Now that queen retreating to f2 block my rook on f, coming to f3, so that would have been quite a challenge for me to continue putting pressure on black's position. This is close, very close for black to equalize. So that would have been a nice reward for my opponent's well played middle game. Now, in time pressure, as I was playing fast, my opponent had to be catching up with me, and right about here, I start gaining big momentum over the board and on the clock. I play e4, creating the opportunity for my knight to move in right there to d5. Knight d3 becomes a threat, winning the pawn on c5. And here also I had an interesting idea. Let's check once again. Knight goes to e6. Well, what's the point? That's a big tactical idea that doesn't actually lead to much of a consequence. Here it actually just not good, because knight captures, queen takes, king h8. But at the same time, you want to calculate this type of tactics. You want to consider all sorts of knight moves. The most obvious is knight d3. But knight e6 looks most interesting, and the one definitely to consider. So why doesn't it work? Well, king just retreats and there's nothing behind it. On the other hand, if let's say rook takes or pawn takes, the idea is very similar. Queen f7 and queen f8. Rook captures, rook takes, and this is a checkmate. Pawn takes, queen f7, queen f8. Rook takes with a checkmate. So this is knight e6, which doesn't work in the moment. I play e4, and my opponent plays rook c8. Now imagine rook goes to e8. Now take a look at this position and figure out the tactical idea. And here it is, knight e6. Super strong in this position. Now if knight takes e6, big detail right here. Rook is on e8, queen takes f7, and I win the game. If pawn takes, we're going to play queen f7 and queen f8, followed by rook f8, checkmate. The other rook takes, same thing, queen f7 and queen f8. Now, knight e6 looks like a brilliant idea of winning the game. On the other hand, black doesn't have to take the knight. Black could just continue queen g6 here. And this knight e6 idea doesn't achieve all that much. But actually, knight c7 I could play, transferring the knight to d5, I could still maintain some pressure and benefit from this knight e6 idea. Queen could go to e7 on the other hand. And, once again, white's idea is not lethal. So, but at the same time, you want to have those in mind. And in case the time is right, deliver those right there. A lot of times it may not work on this move, but it's going to help you later on in the game. Play rook c8, defending the pawn on c5. On the other hand, black is a little bit passive right here, actually quite a bit passive. I'm the one who's going to be dictating the rhythm of the game. I have powerful pieces that are really well connected. Look at this. This is well centralized. Rook f1, rook e1, knight on f4. The game of chess is a lot about centralization, playing through the center, and that is relevant to opening and especially middle game, centralizing your pieces and getting your pieces work through the center. Now, just a little thought right here, it would be incredible to have a powerful bishop right here on c4, hitting that king right there on g8. And that's the type of, patterns and like intuition that you develop. It's like you just see particular spots for particular pieces. And a lot of times you actually have pieces in inferior positions where you transfer them to ideal positions. Like, for example, out here, my knight is coming towards d5. It was in different positions at different stage of the game. It came from h5, was on g3. Now it's getting promoted to the d5 square right there. First, I play rook e3 though, so that the attacking momentum is more important than positional momentum. I bring my rook to the king side. This is a nice rook lift right here. Once again, this is dictated. Well, rook came from a1 to e1, then continued to e3, and now it's on g3 right here. So you bring it from a mediocre spot to a better spot where it can engage. Then it does engage, and then it wins the game right there on the g file. Queen comes back, and now I bring my knight to d5. As you can see, my pieces from from E1, from A1 to E1 to G3. The rook in a powerful spot. Knight came from H5 towards D5, maneuvered throughout. It's actually a big knight. There was big maneuver. If you guys remember, it came to F4 from D3 towards E2, towards G3, towards H5, towards F4 and D4. So it circled all around the board to find the right square. And your pieces are going to maneuver throughout the game to better squares to accomplish certain goals and move on. Here my opponent plays F6. What is happening right here on the board? Well, after knight D5, my queen opens up, my rook opens up right here from F1, and I hit that F7 square. And G7 is vulnerable. Black's pieces, as you can see, white's pieces are super well connected. There's this nice harmony between white's pieces. Black's pieces are disconnected. This rook on E5 is hanging. Anything could happen in this moment where black is going to be losing to a double attack or a fork. Black's pieces are fairly disconnected and passive. Queen on D8 is not doing much. While it's defending the F6 square, it's ready to help. But too many weaknesses out here for black to be able to defend. F6 gives up a pawn right here, but I wouldn't be satisfied winning a pawn. So I direct my attention to the king side right here. So this game, from the middle game, I played excellent moves, going for the best that I could get in this game. So now, instead of picking up this pawn on F6, which is fairly logical, I don't want to do that because there's, let's say, Queen D4. I don't want to play an endgame. I want to win the game with the attack because this position is going to allow me to accomplish that. I can feel it by the texture. I can feel it by the opportunities in this position that I can continue my massive attack and then gain more than just an extra pawn in this position. So this is something that also you develop with intuition, with experience. That's the intuitive understanding of the texture of the game and how much you should get out of it. So you want to get as much as you can. You want to get more rather than less if you have the right opportunity. Now my opponent opts for F5, and here I really go ahead and punish him right here. F5 looks like the way to go until you see Queen F4. Now what it does, as we said, that rook on E5 was disconnected. I'm hitting the rook, and as this maneuver goes on, I'm heading towards H6 and just basically killing the king right there when the knight is gonna connect with F6 right there. So my opponent defends, and here I go, rook H6. This is move 41. So up to this point, I was putting tons of pressure on my opponent. I didn't have that much time, but my opponent had very little time. So it was just about 5 to 6 minutes for me, and my opponent was was close to playing on increment. And here in this position, it's right after time control, move 41, and my opponent is in trouble. There's nothing he can do. The queen needs to be connected to the rook. If rook e6, I win the rook here. After queen d6, then rook is going to capture. Queen cannot retreat and still be defending the rook on e5. And if knight e6, I can continue on with the knight f6 right here, ignoring the fact that my queen is hanging because the king is super vulnerable. There's the ideas of queen h4, directing the attack at the king with the possibility of queen f6, and let's say queen d7, and then goes to f6. So this is impossible to defend. Let's say this little check right here, but the reality, black is just in big trouble right here on the king side, where all of my pieces working in harmony towards the attack, and my pieces are, my opponent's pieces are in placed in a chaotic fashion. So what can we learn from this game? Well, you could be playing either black or white and face a novelty by your opponent, or a move that you're just not familiar with that develops a dynamic play for your opponent, such as, you know, pawn sacrifice. And ultimately, it's not the solution is not to just refuse any sort of pawn sacrifice or any sacrifices, but the solution is to be a little more conservative because you're not familiar with the situation. Lower your standards for how much material you're going to win, but rather just focus on nice development and connecting greater harmony in your game. My pieces were really well connected after I solved the opening problems, and then I continued on to seize the initiative and continuously apply pressure on my opponent's position. My opponent played well the middle game, defended, counterattack, and then eventually had the opportunity to equalize, but overall the amount of pressure I put on him, he didn't manage to respond to the pressure correctly. Eventually made a couple mistakes in a row, and as my pieces connected, the rook on f1, the rook on e1, the queen and the knight created this massive harmonious connection that turned into the decisive attack against black's king.